What's up everyone, it's Mexi. Welcome to another video. The title of this video being There is no such thing as a natural disaster. Clearly, there are biophysical, meteorological, and climatic disruptions and events like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, etc. that have the potential to become real humanitarian disasters. The keyword here is potential. And when we do material analysis of the factors that contribute to an event actually turning into a disaster, what we see is the extent to which it does and the impacts and results that it has, and also who are the ones who suffer versus who are the ones who reap the rewards, has everything to do with our political economy, a racialized, gendered, capitalist economy. But much like all other aspects of our social life, our approaches to solutions to these problems fail so spectacularly because the root political economic causes are never addressed. In fact, they are never even brought to light. In my last video on radical food politics, we talked about how the solutions to hunger, like charity or technological approaches that try to increase food production, continually fail to even make a dent in the problem because the real political economic causes of the problem under our capitalist system are never even looked at, let alone addressed in any meaningful way. Similarly, when it comes to disaster preparedness and mitigation, the political economic determinants of vulnerability and the factors that make entire populations unable to recover from disaster are never looked at, let alone addressed. This is once again considered a technical problem requiring technological solutions from experts and developers. From this perspective, policy recommendations focus on engineering and attempting to control the physical environment, such as building seawalls, instead of wider social change. Instead of considering these things natural disasters, we should be calling them humanitarian disasters with a natural trigger, where the natural trigger event ignites and exaggerates the structural inequalities that capitalism produces along racialized, gendered, and class lines. This is going to be a two-part series where we look at this concept through two well-known examples: Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So this first episode will be about Hurricane Katrina, and the second about Puerto Rico will follow. Hurricane Katrina was such a momentous and memorable event, largely because it really laid bare the contradictions of the free market capitalist system. Onlookers were shocked and appalled at the level of prolonged suffering and the blatant human rights abuses that went on, as certain people were deemed worthy of survival and others, namely poorer people of color, were actually forcibly prevented from escaping and left to die. This natural event, like so many others, really exposed the deep-rooted political economic disaster that had been festering there and many other US cities for decades in terms of shocking injustice and inequality inherent to this racialized capitalism. And it also made fantastically clear the irrational absurdity of relying on a political economic system that hollows out the government completely and shifts the responsibility for risk preparedness and mitigation to private contractors, especially those in the business of profiting off calamity, war, and devastation like Halliburton, Bechtel, Fluor, and Shaw. This was all very good business for a select few and complete desolation for far too many. Katrina hit in August of 2005, but it was not unexpected. Since 2001, knowing that a catastrophic hurricane was likely and would in all probability devastate New Orleans, the Bush administration nonetheless opened hundreds of square miles of wetland to development on the grounds that the market knows best, and in the process eroded New Orleans' natural protection against hurricanes. They cut the New Orleans Corps of Engineers budget by 80%, thus preventing pumping and levee improvements. At the same time, they siphoned resources towards tax cuts for the wealthy and towards economic shock and regime change in Iraq. In the shock doctrine, Naomi Klein makes incredible connections between the devastation wrought on Iraq and the reconfiguring of their economy with what happened in New Orleans, with the same military personnel and mega corporations involved in both. She explains how FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was basically a laboratory for the Bush administration's vision of a government run by private corporations. In 2004, predicting a disaster, the state of Louisiana put in a request to FEMA to devise an in-depth contingency plan for such a hurricane. This request was refused because disaster management was one of the programs that was gutted under Bush. And yet, that same summer, FEMA provided a $500,000 contract to a private company to produce that same plan. The company spared no expense and actually racked up a $1 million bill for the government to pay. The plan they came up with was actually detailed and sensible, however, it did nothing to mitigate the storm when it actually hit, partly because there was no money for follow-up. 8 months after the contractor had submitted their report, no action had been taken. The story is typical of the lopsided state that Bush built, a weak, underfunded, ineffective public sector on the one hand, and a parallel, richly funded corporate infrastructure on the other. When it comes to paying contractors, the sky is the limit. When it comes to financing the basic functions of the state, the coffers are empty. As soon as the hurricane hit Florida, almost 3 days before New Orleans, it was evident that this storm was far more dangerous than its wind speeds had initially suggested. Despite this, FEMA assumed business as usual. They sent only a quarter of available search and rescue teams to the region and no personnel to New Orleans until after the storm had passed. When the National Guard did arrive, it was quickly apparent that they were working under orders to control the city militarily and protect property rather than to bring aid to the desperate. Angry citizens who waded through the city looking for promised buses that never came were prevented at gunpoint from getting out. Groups of victims who were now environmental refugees who tried to organize water, food, and shelter collectively were similarly broken up at gunpoint. 4 days after the hurricane hit, with federal aid still largely absent, President Bush said that refugees should instead rely on private charities such as the Salvation Army. When the first federal aid did come, stunned recipients opened the boxes to find the anthrax vaccine. The spatialities of capitalism are such that rich or wealthy people tend to buy homes on more stable land in nicer areas, leaving the dangerous floodplains or other undesirable land to the poorer classes. As Neil Smith explains, in New Orleans, topographic gradients doubled as class and race gradients, with poorer and working people of color left in the most vulnerable positions. The better off had cars so they could get out of the city, they had credit cards and bank accounts for emergencies, their families had resources for evacuation, and they had insurance policies for rebuilding afterwards. Like so many other places across America, the long history of institutionalized racism meant that the better off were typically white and the poor and vulnerable victims were largely African American. Neil Smith writes, distraught refugees, mostly African American, concluded that they were being left in the New Orleans Superdome and Convention Center to die. They pleaded for help, any help, as they angrily demanded to know why, if reporters could get in and out, that they could not. At all phases, up to and including Reconstruction, disasters don't simply flatten landscapes, washing them smooth. Rather, they deepen and erode the ruts of social difference they encounter. Conditions in the Superdome, where the refugees who were not able or not allowed to leave the city, were appalling. 23,000 people were stranded without food or water. Women were being sexually assaulted. Desperate people were fighting over scarce resources. Businesses and homeowners were the only privileged few who were allowed back through military cordons into the city. The natural event here triggered the underlying deep-rooted humanitarian disaster based around structural inequality that had been festering in New Orleans for so long. The Reconstruction efforts took this to a whole new level. New Orleans, 2 weeks after the disaster, looked like a developer's gold rush. Milton Friedman, the archetype of idealist, unsound economic theory and the father of neoliberalism, along with the Heritage Foundation, hosted a meeting of like-minded ideologues and Republican lawmakers to make a list of pro-free market reforms for dealing with Hurricane Katrina. They came up with 32 in all, but 4 notable prescriptions were automatically suspend Davis-Bacon prevailing wage laws in disaster areas, which is a reference to the law that required federal contractors to pay a living wage, make the entire affected area a flat tax free enterprise zone, make the entire region an economic competitiveness zone, and decimate the public school system in favor of a private charter school system. President Bush accepted all of these within the week, although he was eventually pressured to reinstate the labor standards. But this disaster was used as shock therapy to implement Chicago Boys-style Washington consensus-like policies, privatizing access to goods and social services. As for privatizing primary education, we know how well that works in terms of helping the inequality that actually leads to vulnerability and precariousness that would make people more vulnerable to these kinds of disasters. The companies that snatched the biggest reconstruction contracts were the same that were present in Iraq, the biggest benefactor being Halliburton. All in all, these contracts totaled $3.4 billion. Because these companies had commercial claim over redevelopment, local workers and volunteers were forbidden to help. Kenyon, a division of the mega funeral conglomerate Service Corporation International, a major Bush campaign donor, was hired to retrieve the dead from homes and streets. The work was extraordinarily slow, with bodies left in the broiling sun for days. Emergency workers and volunteers were forbidden to help because this would impinge on Kenyon's commercial territory. What would have been good for local development was if the companies had actually hired local workers and given them a fair wage to help in the reconstruction of their homes. The companies brought in largely illegal immigrants to do the labor so that they could pay them next to nothing. Mike Davis tracked the way that FEMA paid Shaw $175 per square foot to install blue tarps on damaged roofs, even though the tarps themselves were provided by the government. But once all the subcontractors took their share, the workers who actually hammered in the tarps were paid as little as $2 a square foot. Every level of the contracting food chain, in other words, is grotesquely overfed except the bottom rung, where the actual work is carried out. The attacks on the disadvantaged did not stop there. In order to offset all of that money that they paid out to mega contractors, in 2005, the Republican-controlled Congress cut $40 billion from the federal budget. This slashed funding for Medicaid, student loans, and food stamps. In other words, the poorest citizens in the country subsidized the contractor bonanza twice. First, when Katrina relief morphed into unregulated corporate handouts, providing neither decent jobs nor functional public services, and second, when the few programs that directly assist the unemployed and working poor nationwide were gutted to pay those bloated bills. Neoliberal capitalist policies therefore not only created the conditions for this natural event to turn into such a disaster, they also prolonged and deepened the crisis, targeting the have-nots at the expense of the haves, and the neoliberal aftermath, privatizing social services and reconstruction efforts, is ensuring that people will be even more vulnerable to a natural event in the future. Stay tuned for part 2 on Puerto Rico, which will follow. If you like this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really goes a long way. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in another video.